Well, hello and welcome to this edition of the Religion Hurts podcast. My name is Mike Harrison, and I'm excited to just kind of continue going down a journey with you today. If you haven't watched any of this before, I've got a few other episodes out, just mostly talking about my life story, just how I grew up in an abusive household, although very Christian, charismatic, and Pentecostal Christian household, and how I went through abuse as a child and to a really depressed, suicidal as a teenager, and then essentially how as a young married man, my wife and I ended up in a cult, and this started in Ontario, Canada, and ended up in Ocala, Florida, of all places. And I haven't gotten to any of that yet. I'm actually going to touch on that, begin how I ended up getting into there today, and then just talking about a lot of my life story, just kind of my testimony of what God's done in my life. But then additionally, I've just kind of in between there been talking about some real situations that have happened around me in current times and around my wife and I. Just, the heart and the purpose of this podcast being talking about what's happened or is happening to Christians by other Christians, Christian on Christian hate crime, if you will. Maybe a bad joke, but just people, just the ways people have been hurt by other Christians, the ways that churches hurt us. And what does that look like moving forward? Just having a place to be able to discuss and talk about these things. My wife and I have been destroyed by churches again and again, and yet it was never Christ. And we've often found through those situations and those circumstances, we found light and we found life on the other side, and we've got hope. We're part of a great church right now, and we've been there about 5 years. We just love it. We're so thankful for it and thankful for the people in it. And no, there's not people that are perfect in this church. We've been hurt a few times by people that are in our church right now. But as a whole, we've been so blessed by what God's done in our lives, is continuing to do in our lives. And we're just super thankful. And this is just my intention to tell my story up until where we're at now in life, and some of the dark moments, some of the crazy moments, some of the most salacious things, that have happened, and just being able to share all that, but then with always the hope of the recognition that Jesus has not been the source of the problem ever. It's often been me, or it's been, some evil in people, but also I think some good intentions by people that have just hurt. And the way that I've come through it and healed and grown has been incredible. So that's the heart of this today. I'm on a bit of a high today. Some of my best friends in the world are worship pastors at our church, and about a year ago, it was a little over a year for my wife and I, but a year ago that we found some stuff out. But a year ago this past Sunday, at our church, they had gone up and they had shared about how she, our friend, husband and wife, how she had gotten a diagnosis of terminal metastatic breast cancer that was going into her back as well, and there was no cure. There was not really a lot of hope. There was, you can take these drugs and they will change your hormones, put you into menopause. I am not a doctor person, so anything that I missaid with this, forgive me. You can go online and look up her story, and if you don't know where we go to church and you want some information, I'll happily share the link with you. Just send me a message in here, and I will happily get you a link to her story. But she had this incurable terminal cancer, and she could take this medication essentially that would mean no more kids for them. They have one daughter, but no more kids going forward. And the drugs would essentially keep the cancer at bay so she could live, good for as relatively long as possible. And my wife and I have been praying for her constantly. I know my wife for a month with a whole other group of women from the church. They all fasted at least a meal a day, if not more, for I believe it was an entire month. And she's been prayed over by so many people that just, because these two are just, they're the most incredible humans, like the perfect example of Christianity. I alluded to them in the last podcast about talking about myself going through some dark times and making some really big mistakes out of those dark times. And these pastors, rather than judge me and rip me to shreds over my mistakes, and trust me, my mistakes deserved it, they specifically went out of their way to love me through it, walk me through as I went to the board of the church and had full discussions, and were there beside me, spent countless hours texting, phone calling, spending time with me, and helping me find freedom and joy and peace in my life. And you can say, well, they're pastors, they're supposed to do that. Look, I've known a lot of pastors that don't do a tenth of that kind of effort into people's lives. And these guys did. And they gave me a hope, and they gave me a future. Of course, that future was based in Christ, but their warring on my behalf is a lot of why I'm here today. Super thankful for it. So was crushed, really crushed here when I found out this. So why am I on a high this week? And is because she got to come and speak on the same stage 1 year later. And she just had a scan at the end of February, and they found no evidence of cancer in her body at this time. Something that's impossible is a miracle. I'm so incredibly thrilled. You know, I have been all over the world now. I'll get into this at some point down the road, but I work for an organization called Christ for All Nations as a freelancer. Driving truck that moves equipment for large gospel crusades all over the continent of Africa. When as doing that, I set up for these crusades, and then we have speakers come in and preach the gospel, and it's always basically the same thing. It's a simple gospel message, and I say simple because we love to, as Christians, go really far down deep doctrinal holes and kind of convince everybody of everything. And the simple gospel is just that we're all sinners, right? We've all failed. We all don't deserve God's love and grace because we've all failed. We all have done horrible things. We all, we're born into sin. And sin just means, separated from God. It means doing the wrong things, all those kinds of things. But essentially, we've all done this stuff, and we've all been separated from God. And the simple gospel message is that Jesus, who was the Son of God, came to earth in human form, lived a perfect life, the only one to ever do it, and then died on the cross to pay the price for all the sins of mankind. And that whoever believes in him doesn't have to continue in sin and all that. They have the opportunity to join him and become a child of God alongside. And that's just the simple gospel. And when you go to these places and you preach the simple gospel message, the response to it is absolutely incredible. And they will also speak about the Holy Spirit, and then pray for people that are sick and hurting and dying. And the amount of miracles that I've seen, the amount of people that I've seen healed. My most recent thing, I was in Ethiopia, and it was a rainy night. And Daniel Kalenda, who's actually the head of Christ for All Nations, he was speaking on this particular evening. It was pouring rain, and he stood out in the rain, preaching to what was a small crowd of 20,000 people, which is a small crowd for Africa. but these are 20,000 hungry souls that were literally standing in knee-deep mud to hear this gospel message. And as Daniel sat in the rain and preached, he got to the point of just being able to pray for the sick. And I remember the whole night felt a little chaotic, wasn't really going quite the way a lot of this would normally go. And he kind of stopped in the middle of it all. I just stopped, prayed quietly, then prayed for everybody, then began to just talk about healing and God's desire to see healing in people, and then prayed for healing over, people in the crowd. And in the middle of it, he stopped and he pointed at a woman and said, "I believe God's healing your ears right now." And I watched as probably out of those 20,000 people, 3,000 people lined up to give testimony at the end of the healings that God had done. And specifically, this woman that he pointed out, I watched her not be able to understand him. I was standing there off to the side of the platform, and I could see that she couldn't hear what he was saying. I watched as he made this remark and prayed for her, and I watched as her ears opened, and the expression that came on her face and the surprise as her ears opened, and she came up on stage, and she hadn't, I don't remember all the details, but she was an older woman, and it had been years and years since she could hear anything. I've seen lame people come in on crutches and all kinds of things that can't walk and throw the crutches away. I've seen blind people that couldn't see when they got there have their eyes open. I've seen, whether you want to believe all this stuff or not, I've seen people completely possessed and of a different mind be set free. And it's an incredible thing. It definitely opens your eyes. So I've got a really strong belief and foundation system of seeing God work miracles and being able to see this person who's a really close friend of my wife and I, being able to just hear the story and the elation for her and for the entire church of watching this cancer get defeated is such an incredible thing to watch. And I was so happy about it. And so, like I said, I'm a little bit elated today and kind of just really, really happy for her and happy for everything that's going on. And so just such an incredible gift. Part of the reason for doing this podcast is talking about the cruelty that I think Christians perpetuate on each other. There's almost like this: if you're a sinner, and you're out in the world and you're not saved, the Christian word for accepting Jesus into your heart, and you're living that lifestyle, and I come and I share what we call the good news or the gospel or whatever you want to say it, however you want to put it. If I come and I share that with you, then there's all this forgiveness from me to you or forgiveness from God to you that we'll express regarding that situation. And when you're not saved and come to Jesus, there's a lot of grace and a lot of openness from most Christians to the unsaved. But when there's Christians that are struggling and hurting and coming through life that way, or are perceived to be that way, the harshness from one Christian to the next Christian is unbelievable often. And the judgment and cruelty that goes from one Christian to the next is just unreal. And one of the things that shocked me is somebody this week made a comment to her before she was coming up to give the message. Hopefully she'll forgive me for sharing this. I'm going to try to keep it a little bit vague because I don't want to put words in her mouth or say that it was exactly like this. But she was talking about how getting up to share opens her up to people making comments that are often not encouraging or kind at all, but are destructive and tear her down. And to me, I just can't even begin to understand that. Even if you don't believe in healing, and even if you don't believe that God is real, and even if you don't all those things, how do you operate in that kind of cruelty? And somebody essentially said, along the lines of, what have you done to deserve God healing you? I'm just like, why? Why would you say that to anybody? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But I was at I was at work today, and I subcontract for a company, and I was working with the guys today, and there's a story about the pyramids that came up and who built the pyramids, and there was some comments made from one Christian about how their view and how they were made, and some of the guys who either are kind of newbie Christians or don't have a lot of understanding, and a couple of them that aren't Christians at all. They couldn't understand what this person was saying as to this, and it kind of goes on this deep philosophical, homiletic or whatever you want to call it, journey about all these different things. I'm not even getting into what this person's suggestion as to how these pyramids were made came, but somebody said, that doesn't make any sense to me. And the person commented, well, you just don't know that much, or you're not really that educated as a Christian if you don't know this. And the surprise on the guys' faces to this was a little bit kind of shocking to me. And just something I've come to the realization of is how often we do this as Christians, that we believe we have an understanding or a revelation or a word from God or a view as to how things are. I can sit there and say, look, I was in Africa. I've seen with my own eyes, God heals. And then when somebody says to me, I don't know if healing's for today, I don't know if God does that, what do I do with something like that? Do I sit there and say, well, you're an idiot, you're a bad person, you're not a good Christian, you don't understand the way that God moves? Blah. Am I going to sit there and treat that person like that? Or am I going to sit there and say, look, God, I'm trusting that your relationship with that person matters enough to you that you'll bring them along to a revelation of you when the time comes, and all those things. I don't need to prove God is right. I think God does enough to prove he's right on his own. I think it's really is just my responsibility to love that person right where they're at right now, today. I work with a guy pretty regularly that's had a history of drug abuse and has gone back to that a few times, and it's kind of gotten to the point that some of his friends and stuff, they just doubt him. They just don't believe who he is and what he's trying to do in his life. And I get it to a degree. He's screwed up multiple times. So I get to a degree the uncertainty of, will he go back to this again or won't he go back to this again? But I see something even more important than that. And I see the ability to say, this is still a child of God that still needs my love and consideration and my support. And maybe he will fail again. I pray that he won't, but maybe he will. What am I going to do with that? How am I going to treat him? How am I going to respond to him? Where am I going to go with something along those lines, right? And I just want to love him and support him and be there and encourage him. I think, yes, accountability. I think accountability is a huge thing. But accountability to me is my heart's open to you to challenge me about where I'm at. And if we have that kind of relationship, then I think accountability is a great thing. These worship pastors that I was talking about, we have a relationship of accountability. But there's people at the church, if they came and they just flat out challenged me about where stuff is, I'm not saying I wouldn't listen to them, but it'd be hard to understand the heart for it. If they haven't shown me love, but they just show me, well, you're wrong in this, and this, then how is that love? And I think it's something we as Christians have to at least consider and ask ourselves when we're doing that. So, okay, I don't have a ton of time left on this video, but I really want to carry on with my story and get moving here. So I was about 24 years old when my wife and I got married. I think it was exactly 24, not about. And we were living in Burnsville, Minnesota. I started a small construction company, and we just financially were struggling. It was in '08 when home prices, everything crashed. We were living there. We got married in '04, but we're living in Minneapolis. Not a ton of it happened during that time frame. Just living a nice young newlywed lifestyle. We had our first child 3 years into our marriage, and his name is Callan. I love that kid. He's 18 years old now, just a phenomenal young man. I don't deserve that as a dad, how great he is as a son. But, we decided we're living there, and we decided we want to move to North Dakota. That's where my wife's from. We just financially, it was just always really tight for us there. My wife didn't want to, she was working at a salon. She didn't want to keep working. So during this kind of period, there's kind of a time frame that there's not really a lot to say about. We were living for I think 4 years in Minneapolis, then we moved to North Dakota, and before we went to the cult was almost 4 years, and probably 6-ish years of that was just really a pretty normal life. All the things that young couples have, maybe not much money, whatever, kind of just the normal thing, and God brought us through all that. There's not a lot to get into with all that, so I'm not going to waste and bore all you all that are giving me this attention or this time to really get into that. So now we're living in North Dakota. Okay, I was self-employed at the time, had a small construction business, kind of similar to what I did now, without near the knowledge. But I was just doing a lot of handyman type construction things, odds and ends, and so we decided that we were going to, my father-in-law had gotten a contract. He's an electrician, a master electrician, and he'd gotten a large contract and all these little towns in North Dakota that were kind of around his area. The phone company in that area was called United Telephone. And United Telephone was upgrading all of the homes in their service area from essentially a copper line coming into the house. It was kind of old and dated and not working real well. This kind of internet's becoming bigger and faster, right? And they put all these homes on a fiber optic line buried up to the house. And then my father-in-law got this contract that for every house that was in service with United Telephone, which was almost everybody, to take and attach all those houses, take the system off the copper lines and put it essentially onto the fiber lines. Then they were also selling television and internet through this new system. And so he hired 3 crews of 2, so 6 guys, but 3 installation crews that would go around and do all this. And then he hired me as the supervisor for these 3 crews. And so for the last 2 years that I was in North Dakota, I was supervising and managing these crews that were doing all this work. I actually really loved the work. And but in there, I probably will in the next video maybe do a little bit of backstory to it, but I kind of just want to get into what led to us moving back to Ontario and getting into a cult. So I had told you a little bit about how my dad was really sick. He had a lung disease. Well, I'm living in North Dakota at this time, and my dad finds out that his lungs are essentially this close to being done. He ended up in the hospital, and they said, look, you have only a couple months left to live. If you're lucky, your lungs are this close to collapsing and being done. Our recommendation is that you get a heart transplant. And so at some point in the months before this, my brother, so I have one brother and 2 sisters. Brother and sister are twins right after me. So me, 1.5 years later, brother and sister, 1.5 years or 2 years after them is my youngest sister. So 4 of us in 3.5 years. Sorry, Mom. And they, my brother had moved with his wife and 2 daughters to Ontario at this point. Had just decided that there was, he had a construction company. He wanted to sell it out. He wanted to do some mortgages and things of that nature, and some church stuff that I'll kind of get into at another point when I got a little bit more time, just giving a little bit of background on his decision. But he was out there and with these grandkids, and my sister, my youngest sister, had moved out there as well. And my parents decided that, if he's got to go and get a lung transplant, there was 2 places in Canada that he could get this transplant. One was in Toronto, and the other was in Vancouver. Well, he had a brother in Vancouver, but he decided that he'd rather obviously be around grandkids and for my mom and stuff. And my dad's parents lived in close to Toronto. My mom's parents lived close to Toronto. She had family, relatives, everything there. So they decided best bet was to go out by Toronto. And this is actually where I had grown up till I was 14, was that area. So they went back out there. My dad went to get a lung transplant, and we had gotten to go out a few times and visit him. And my brother was part of this church group, which was a small group that was part of the Toronto Airport Church, or Catch the Fire. And I'll get into some of that again later. And my brother was part of this. And so we went out, we visited him. We went to his small group. And there was a couple there named Chris and Brenda that really, they were kind of extraordinary people. And what they were teaching and what they were believing, what they were saying God could do was such unlike anything I'd ever heard. They claimed to see dead people raised from the dead under the power of God, multiple healings, and they had this vision for what God was doing that I would say really resonated with me at the time. And then, here I'm vulnerable because in spite of my the difficulty with my dad growing up, he was still my dad. And here he was, basically, he was either in the hospital or sometimes at his own apartment, but barely able to survive. And a few things all happened right around the exact same time. We had found out, my wife and I had found out that her youngest brother had gotten molested by another kid that went to the youth group with him a couple years before this. And he was a teenager at this time. So at the time it was maybe 9, 10, 11, somewhere in there. I don't remember the exact ages. And he had told a friend, and this friend came and told me. And I was just, I loved this guy. And I really wanted to, my heart just hurt instantly, like anybody's would when you find something like this out. And my father-in-law, a master electrician, businessman, worked for him, was and is an incredible man in a lot of ways. Very, very solid, very strong in his faith. Everything in a lot of ways that my dad wasn't. He wasn't way over the top. He wasn't extreme. He was just a very steady man, just very consistent in his life, very consistent with everything. And someone that I really, truly admired and respected and still do. And I went to tell him about all this, and he didn't know what to do with it. He had no idea where to go and what to do. And the entire experience in that moment wrecked my heart. Now, I didn't have this understanding at the time, but remember, I was a little boy once upon a time who got molested, and nobody protected me. Nobody did anything about it. And in that time frame, when I heard these words coming from my father-in-law, like he didn't know what to do, and kind of almost like this, that's all I just felt. I was that little boy again, just completely devastated. And in that same time frame, my dad's lungs collapsed, and he was rushed into the hospital and put on an iron lung, where he was kept alive for almost 2 weeks on this iron lung, which is essentially just a box that they pump his blood through, and they inject oxygen into it, and they kept him alive. And my wife and I went out and saw him, and he was a skeleton with skin, lying on a table with more tubes and things that I've ever seen any person ever have in them. And I was really upside down as a person at that time frame. I wasn't sleeping. I might get a half hour to an hour of sleep a night. I go about a week or two, and I get so exhausted that I'd fall asleep for like 12, 13 straight hours out of sheer exhaustion. And then the next night we'd be back to the same, can't sleep. The only way I could sleep at all at that time frame was to drink. And so I wasn't a huge go out and party person. I wasn't even a huge get drunk person. I would just literally get a glass, pour some whiskey in it with some ice, and I just sit there. And I drink a couple of those at night because the only way I could calm down enough to settle, that I could be at peace, and then I could fall asleep, kind of, maybe an hour and a half or a little bit, and then I'd wake up and anxious and uneasy. And I mean, that was my life for quite some time. So this with my dad's lungs collapsing, this whole issue with finding this out with my father-in-law and my brother-in-law, and then in the middle of this, I meet this Chris and Brenda, and they showed me a love that at the time I believed was real and was everything that I'd hoped for, coming from, a place of being rejected by my father again and again and again, watching my father-in-law, at the time, me feeling like he rejected his own son, and me feeling that the pain of that. I'm an extremely empathetic person, to the point that I have to watch, because I will pick up other people's feelings, to the point that it destroys my own heart, something I always have to watch and be careful of. And so when we went out to visit my dad, we went to this small group again, and they began to speak some things to us, about how we needed to move, and we needed to come there, and we needed to be part of everything, and we needed to fulfill our destiny and see all these things. And we didn't move then, but they really started some deep rooted stuff in us. It will go on to be that these two people are some of the biggest monsters I've ever met in my life. The amount of money that they've stolen from people, the amount of destruction that they've done, the absolute massive wake of destruction that has followed in their lives is incredible. But in that moment's time, when you're broken, destroyed, hurting, not sleeping, and feel completely lost, everything they said in that moment was exactly what I needed to hear, and it brought me into that place. So I'm going to get into this a lot more with a little bit more background on the next one. It's hard when you're trying to keep your videos to about 20 minutes, and then you get talking about a friend of yours that's cancer free. How can you not be a little bit excited about that and want to talk about that instead? So I apologize for the length of this video, but I appreciate you so much for tuning in and just being part of this journey with me. I'm thrilled to just kind of talk more about this. Always open to questions, and I love you all. Thank you so much. May God just bless your week, and we'll talk to you soon.